The Philadelphia Navy Yard, 1943, a destroyer escort sits at a dock, the USS Eldridge, and the men standing on her deck have been told they're about to disappear. Literally disappear. Disappear as in vanish. It's a Navy experiment. Hush hush, wartime. The plan is to bend light and radar around the ship and make her invisible to German eyes. They throw the switch, and a greenish haze comes up out of nowhere and wraps around the ship's hull. The air hums, and then the Eldridge is gone. And I'm not talking about cloaked or obscured. It's literally gone. A ship-shaped hole in the water sits where 300 feet of steel used to be. Minutes go by, and when she comes back, so do the crew, or what's left of them. One sailor is walking across the deck, and he steps straight through a solid steel wall in front of his crew. He's never seen again. Two more men spontaneously catch fire where they stand, and they don't stop. The fires burn for 18 straight days. Others come back frozen. They're wide awake. They're locked inside their own skin. A few snap out of it in a couple hours. Some take months, and most of them come back totally mad. The man who first told this story summed it up in one line. He said the experiment was a complete success. The men were a complete failure. Now, the United States Navy has said not one word of this has ever happened. No invisible ship, no burning men, none of it. And by all outward appearances, they've got a case. But the people who believe it, they don't think the story ends at the dock. They think the experiment never died. They think it just went quiet, it went black, it waited, and that 40 years later, it came roaring back out at the far eastern tip of Long Island at a worn-down army base called Camp Hero. They say it wasn't sailors this time. It was kids, runaways that nobody would come looking for. They're strapped into a chair that could reach inside a human mind and tear a hole straight through time. They call it the Montauk Project. The base is real. You can drive out there today. The giant radar tower is still standing. You can see it. Just about everything else, nobody can prove. The Navy denies it. The records are gone. And the men who swear they lived it, you're going to meet them. I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History, coming at you from the great state of Vermont. I want to know what really happened at Montauk. How much of it, if any, actually happened? Stay with me. Before we get to the chair and the kids and the whole punch through time, let's put our feet on solid ground. Let's talk about what's real. The base at the center of this whole thing is real, and the true story behind it is strange on its own. 1942, the Army comes out to the tip of Long Island, to the bluffs above Montauk Point, and builds a fort. They name it Camp Hero, after a real man, Major General Andrew Hero Jr., the Army's Chief of Coast Artillery. And the reason for its existence? Fear. It's the middle of World War II. German U-boats are prowling the Atlantic, and they're close enough to the coast that people watch ships burn from the beach. I've been on that beach. The nightmare keeping everyone up at night is the prospect of an enemy fleet showing up in New York Harbor and shelling it from the water. Camp Hero's one job is to stand guard over the front door to New York Harbor. So they arm it. Heavy. 16-inch guns, barrels long as telephone poles. They're sunk into bunkers of solid concrete. These things throw shells the weight of a small car more than 20 miles out at sea. But here's the first strange thing about this place. You weren't supposed to be able to see any of it. From the air, from the deck of a passing ship, Camp Hero wasn't built to look like a fort. It was built to look like a sleepy little fishing village. I'm not making that up. The local gym, they dressed it up like a church. They gave it a fake steeple. The barracks were done up to pass for a row of plain houses. Windows, doors, all of it actually painted right onto the concrete. So a German sub-captain would put his eye into the periscope and see a quaint New England fishing town. You get the picture here. They'd never know they were staring straight down the barrels of guns that could sink a fleet. A military base disguised as something harmless. It's hiding what it really was. Hold on to that one. We're going to circle back. The war ends, and overnight, the guns are junk. The day of the big coastal cannon is finished. Airplanes run the world now. They cut those 16-inch guns up for scrap by the late 40s, and Camp Hero goes quiet for about a minute because a new fear moves in right behind the old one. Now it's the Soviets, and the threat isn't ships anymore, it's bombers coming over the top of the world with nuclear weapons. So America strings up a giant electronic fence. It's a ring of radar stations watching the skies all around the country. And at that spot on the eastern tip of Long Island, staring dead straight out at the Atlantic, is just about the perfect spot. The Air Force takes over the base, new name, Montauk Air Force Station, and the 773rd Radar Squadron moves in. They wire it into something called SAGE. SAGE was the most ambitious computer system of its day. It was a continent-sized network that swallowed radar signals and fed them right back to fighter jets and missiles in real time. Montauk was one of its eyes, and around 1960, they bolt on the centerpiece, the AN-FPS-35 radar. It's a beast. The antenna is about the size of a drive-in movie screen, a giant curved sail of steel. It turns slowly on the top of a building. It reached more than 200 miles and planes halfway to Europe. Now, oddly enough, it threw out so much power that people in town swore that every time the antenna swung around and pointed to town, their TVs would flicker and die. Radios too. The picture would sometimes roll in rhythm with the radar. They had to tune the thing over and over to keep it from knocking out half the town. A machine pushing out so much invisible energy that it reached right into the people's living rooms. That part's real. Remember it. By 1980, the FPS-35 is a dinosaur. Satellites do the job now. We're not fooling around. On January 31st, 1981, Montauk Air Force Station shuts its doors for good. But they did an odd little thing on the way out. That giant radar, they didn't tear it down. They just left it. They walked off and abandoned the whole tower right where it stood. Now, I mentioned before, it's still up there. The last intact FPS-35 left anywhere in the country. So that's the official story, front to back. A coastal fort, then a Cold War radar post, lights out in 1981. Now, this is the exact spot where the official story and the legend get a little hazy. Partly because Camp Hero really did have an underground world. That's not a theory. The gun batteries were buried in concrete. They were bunkers, tunnels, sub-levels cut into the bluff. The question the believers ask is, just how far down does it go? They'll tell you 12 levels, hundreds of feet straight down. It's a secret city under the sand. The Army says, don't be ridiculous. There's nothing down there but old sealed up bunkers. But it's just weird because some of those grassy hillsides have doors. Heavy concrete doors. They're set right into the hill. They're bolted shut. And the people who go poking around those ruins, they come back with pictures. Graffiti scratched into the walls down in the dark. One of it reads, "Stranger, help me." Now, a locked door and some spooky spray paint certainly don't add up to a conspiracy. For that, you need a man and a story. And in 1984, one came walking right up to that abandoned base. He said he worked there. The only problem was, he couldn't remember a single day of it. That man had a name, Preston Nichols. Nichols was born in 1946, Long Island, born and raised, and by his own telling, he was a serious man of science. He said he held degrees in electrical engineering, in psychology, and parapsychology. He worked deep in the world of defense electronics for years. Radios, antennas, frequencies, the invisible stuff. Now, purportedly, some of those credentials are hard to pin down. Skeptics went looking, things don't look too good. It's weird because the man clearly knew his way around a circuit. That part nobody really argues. The question we're left with is how an electronics guy ends up standing in an abandoned army base with no memory of ever working there. The answer comes around 10 years later, 1974. In 1974, Preston Nichols was working on something that sounds kind of bold. He came at it like an engineering problem. He was studying telepathy. He had himself a group of psychics, sensitives, and he said he was wiring them up, testing them, trying to measure what comes out of the human mind, and he hit a wall. Every single day at the exact same time, his psychics would just go dark, like somebody flipped a switch inside their heads, and 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, like clockwork. Their minds would jam, they would go blank, and the readings would flatline. Nichols was an engineer. The problem needed solving, so he went hunting. His thinking was simple. If something's switching these minds off on a schedule, then something's out there broadcasting a signal on a timer. So he grabbed his radio gear, he bolted a TV antenna on the roof of his car, and he went driving down the coast, chasing a signal that nobody else could even feel. The needle pulled him east all the way to the end of Long Island. It pulled him to Montauk, to a radar station out on the point. The one we just spent 10 minutes talking about. Hold that thought. In 1974, the base wasn't abandoned yet. It was still active and still locked up tight. It's 10 years later, 1984, when Nichols comes back, and by then, the place is a tomb. He walks the grounds. Inside the buildings, it's chaos. Equipment everywhere, papers, machinery, gear. It's just dropped where it sat. It's like everybody who worked there just got up one morning and ran. He realizes he's not alone. There's a man living in the ruins, a drifter. He's squatting in the bones of a government base, and this dude starts talking, rambling. Says he used to work here back when it was running, right up to the day something came through. A beast, he calls it. Something monstrous. It tore the place apart and sent everyone running for their lives. And then the drifter turns to Preston Nichols and says the thing that rips this whole story wide open. He tells Nichols he used to work here. Now, Nichols doesn't remember a base or remember a beast. He doesn't remember one single shift. But this total stranger is staring him dead straight in the eye, swearing that he was part of it. And something in Nichols cracks. He starts to believe this man is right. There's a hole in his own memory, a piece of his own life that somebody reached in and wiped clean. So Nichols sets out to get it back. Him and a friend named Duncan Cameron, they start doing what they call deprogramming. They're digging at all the locked up corners of their own minds, trying to knock loose whatever was buried. And they say it works. By 1990, memories come flooding back. Years of them. A whole secret career out there that Nichols never even knew he lived. And in 1992, he writes it all down. A book, The Montauk Project, Experiments in Time, is written with a partner who went by Peter Moon. And that book is the match that lights everything you ever heard about Montauk. The chair, the kids, the time tunnel, the monster. All that traces back to this one man and a set of memories he says were stolen from him, then dug back up. First off, there's no paperwork, none. There's no record that Preston Nichols ever worked at any secret project out at that base. And his degrees, like I said, are hard to verify. The entire foundation of this story is recovered memory. Memories the man didn't have until he went looking for them. And recovered memories, they're shaky ground. It's one of the few things the human brain can build from nothing. Vivid, detailed, bone deep certain, and purportedly, maybe even objectively false. So a fair person has to hold on to two things in their head at once. A trained electronics engineer who tracked a real signal to a real base and said that the base did the impossible, and not one shred of proof that the impossible part ever happened. But Preston Nichols never said Montauk started with him. He never even said it started with Montauk. He said it started somewhere else years before on a dock in Philadelphia in 1943 with a Navy experiment that the United States government spent 80 years swearing that it never happened. So Nichols said it all kicked off in Philadelphia in 1943. A Navy ship vanished. Now my question, where'd he get that? Because that story, the Philadelphia experiment, it doesn't come from the Navy. It comes from a stack of letters written by one very strange man. His name was Carl Allen, born May 31st, 1925, on a farm in Pennsylvania, youngest of 3 kids, an Irish father, and by some tellings, a gypsy or Romani mother. He quit school in the 9th grade, and then he just drifted. A wanderer, a reader, a guy who couldn't sit still. And somewhere out there, he gave himself a new name, something with a little more mystery to it. Carlos Miguel Allende. In 1943, Carl Allen is a merchant seaman. He's fresh out of seaman school. He signs onto a Liberty ship, the SS Andrew Forsyth, and he would swear for the rest of his life that from the deck of that ship, he watched another ship disappear, a destroyer escort, the one from the very start of this video. You already saw what he said happened to the men on that deck. I'm not going to put you through that twice. But jump ahead to 1955, a man named Morris Jessup, an astronomer and a writer, he puts out a book, The Case for the UFO. And Jessup's whole pitch is this. He thinks the government should pour money into Albert Einstein's unified field theory. He's convinced that it's the key to know how flying saucers fly. Carl Allen reads that book and then goes to one of Jessup's lectures. And when Jessup stands up there and begs that crowd to push for more research into the exact theory, something in Allen lights up, and not in a good way. So he starts writing Jessup letters, and these letters are really something. All caps where you least expect it, no punctuation when you need it, words spelled 6 different ways, and words he flat out invented. He tells Jessup that Einstein actually finished the unified field theory back in 1925, and then he pulled it. He buried it for reasons, and this is Allen's words, called humantics. In the letters, he lays the whole thing out. The Navy made a ship invisible. He gives up the name of his own ship, the Forsyth, but the experimental ship, he plays coy. He won't say the name for years. And decades later, he finally coughs it up, the DE-173. So, let's talk about that ship for the record, the real one, the USS Eldridge. It's a destroyer escort, hull number DE-173, built up in Newark, New Jersey at a yard called Federal Shipbuilding. She was small, quick, 306 feet of gray steel, around 1,200 tons, built for exactly one job: hunting German submarines out of the freezing North Atlantic. The keel was laid in February 1943, it was in the water by July, handed to the Navy on August 27, 1943. So here's the honest question. If she didn't teleport, what in the world was actually going on aboard that ship? Turns out, we got an answer from a man who was actually there. His name was Edward Dudgeon. He served on a second ship, the USS Enstrom, tied up in the same Philadelphia yard right alongside the Eldridge. Decades later, Dudgeon laid it all out. Both ships did carry secret gear, that much is true, but it had nothing to do with vanishing. It was a process called degaussing. You wrap the ship's hull in heavy electrical cable, you run current through it, and you cancel out the ship's magnetic field. Now, why bother doing this? Because the Germans built mines and torpedoes that homed in on the magnetic signature of a steel ship. So yeah, the Navy absolutely made the ship invisible, just not to the naked eye, to mines. Now picture a young sailor, a couple beers deep in a Navy yard bar, half hears an officer brag that we made the ship invisible today. You can see how a thing like that sprouts legs and takes off running. Even that famous green glow around the ship has a boring answer. Electricity dancing in the air, St. Elmo's fire, maybe just a storm rolling in off the water. And the Eldridge herself, she finished out the war, she got mothballed, and in 1951 the Navy sold her off to Greece. They gave her a new name, the Lion. And that ship, the most famous teleporting vessel in all human history, it went on to spend 40 more years under a Greek flag. It did plain old Navy work, escorts, patrols, nothing strange about any of it, until sometime in the 90s, they cut her up for scrap. So no green fire, no screaming men, just a long, ordinary life and a scrapyard at the end of it. That is the documented Eldridge. So hold on to them both in your head at once. The legend's vanishing ship, the Navy's degaussing barge that sailed on for another 40 years, because now we're going to go back to Carl Allen and those letters. He name drops a buddy, my friend Dr. Franklin Reno. Hold on to that name as well. Researchers burned years hunting for Dr. Franklin Reno. Spoiler alert, there was no Dr. Franklin Reno. There's a road out by Oil City, Pennsylvania, Route 62, and driving it, you'll pass two little towns, Franklin and Reno. Carl Allen drove past a road sign and gave himself a scientist, but the letters aren't even the strange part. Summer 1955, a package turns up at the Office of Naval Research in Washington. It's addressed to the chief of the ONR, an admiral named Firth. Postmarked Seminole, Texas, and scrolled across the front of that envelope in ink, two words, Happy Easter. Inside is a copy of Jessup's book, and every margin, every scrap of white space is crammed with handwritten notes, in 3 different colors of ink as well. Like 3 different people were passing the book back and forth, arguing in the margins about undersea cities, force fields, deep freeze, about 2 races of aliens. One bunch they called the LMs, the others they called the SMs. 2 officers at the ONR get a hold of this book, a commander named George Hoover and a captain named Sidney Sherby. Now, oddly enough, they don't laugh it off. They take this scribbled up flying saucer paperback down to the defense contractor in Garland, Texas, an outfit called Varo, and they have the entire book retyped and reprinted. Every word of that text, every last lunatic note in the margins. The Varo edition. Black ink for the book, red ink for the madness. There's a small run of copies for some of our top people. So crazy as it may seem, 2 United States Navy officers spent real government effort mimeographing a UFO book full of alien margin notes and passed it around through military channels. Now that happened. That's not in dispute. In 1957, they bring Jessup to look at it, and he can't explain it. Nobody can. And right around there, Morris Jessup's life starts falling apart. A car wreck, trouble in his marriage. The people close to him said that he was never quite the same after that book. And on April 20th, 1959, Morris Jessup is found dead. He's in a station wagon, he's in a county park outside of Miami, and a hose is run from his exhaust pipe in through the window. It was ruled a suicide, which is odd only in a sense that no autopsy was ever done. Which, like I said, for a suicide is odd. Now, years later, a woman in Miami gets a hold of the medical examiner's file, and she finds Jessup's blood was saturated with alcohol more than a killing dose, plus a medication that mixed with that much alcohol could have stopped his heart all on its own. So, was it suicide? Or did Morris Jessup just know too much? I can't tell you. Nobody can. But the question never went away. And then 10 years after the letters first started comes the twist. 1969, Carlos Allende walks into a UFO research group out in Tucson, Arizona called APRO, and he confesses, said he made the whole thing up. The letters, the annotations, all of it a hoax. He cooked up, in his own words, to scare the hell out of Jessup. So that's it. A tragic prank, case closed. A drifter pulled a prank that got away from him. Not so much. Because the man that took that confession, a man named Jim Lorenzen, he sat with Allende for over an hour in a parked car, and in that car, Allende still swore that the ship really vanished. Said it dropped off the dock in Philadelphia and then turned up near Norfolk, then vanished a second time. Told Lorenzen to go find the sailors who were aboard the ship and ask them for himself. Read his confession close and you catch it. He took back the letters, he took back the notes, he never took back the ship. This is where the legend gets ambitious. It doesn't just stop at a drifter and his letters, it reaches for the biggest names in the history of physics. It says the project was born out of the mind of Albert Einstein, out of his unified field theory. It says the man crunching the numbers was John von Neumann, the father of the modern computer. And it says the whole thing was first run by Nikola Tesla himself. And that is where this story walks straight into a calendar. Because Nikola Tesla died on January 7th, 1943, 9 months before the experiment the legend says he helped build that October. Follow the same thread forward out to Montauk, and it only gets worse. The story says that John von Neumann didn't just work on that ship in 43. It says he went on to run the Montauk Project for decades, deep into the 70s and the 80s. Just one problem. John von Neumann died on February 8th, 1957. The man this story puts in charge of a secret base in 1983 was in the ground for 26 years. So let's total it up. Honestly, on one side, the ship is real. The USS Eldridge absolutely existed, a real destroyer escort. On the other side, the Navy denies every inch of it. Word for word, the official line is that the ONR, quote, has never conducted any investigations on invisibility either in 1943 or at any other time. Got that? So now you've got a confessed hoaxer who wouldn't fully take it back, and you got two dead physicists the story can't explain. By every rule of evidence, this should be finished. A done deal. Except for one loose thread. Somebody finally went and did the obvious thing. They went looking for the ship's logs, the deck logs of the Eldridge, the logbooks of the Furuseth, for those exact months in 1943. Now, if those ships sat quiet at a dock the whole time, the logs would prove it. End of story. The Eldridge's logs for that exact same stretch, well, they came back missing and unavailable. And the Furuseth's logbooks, destroyed by executive order. Curious. The Furuseth's the ship from which Carl Allen witnessed the invisibility tests purported to have happened on the Eldridge. Preston Nichols said it all began on the Eldridge. So that should be the end of it. The Navy says that the Eldridge never vanished. The Eldridge's own logs put her on convoy duty. So case closed. Unless you ask one more question. What if it was never the Eldridge? Here's a name the Navy never has to deny. The USS Martha's Vineyard. Because that ship started life as something else entirely. A private yacht named the Thelma. In January 1943, a civilian named George A. Miller handed his yacht over to the United States Navy to help win the war. The Navy took it, they stripped it, they renamed it the Martha's Vineyard, and they stamped its hull with a number that tells you nothing. IX-47. That IX, that's the Navy's code for miscellaneous. It's the label you slap on a ship when you'd rather not say what it really is. And what they used it for was experiments. On paper, it's an experimental minesweeper. They ran tests with it out in a lake in New Jersey, then out in the Long Island Sound. And there's reports of strange incidents aboard that ship during a secret experiment. Incidents that sound an awful lot like the ones pinned on the Eldridge. So stay with me on this. When a Navy spokesperson swears hand on heart that the USS Eldridge never took part in any invisibility test, he may have been actually telling you the gospel truth. Because maybe the ship that did was never called the Eldridge at all. Maybe it was a donated yacht with a miscellaneous hull number that the world remembered by the wrong name. To be fair, the legend points at the Eldridge. Carl Allende pointed at the Eldridge, and there's no record of the Martha's Vineyard ever sailing to Philadelphia either. So I can't hand you proof, just my own musings and speculation. I can tell you this: the Eldridge never did it and it never happened are two very different sentences, and the gap between them is big enough to sail a yacht through it. Know what I'm saying? What Nichols said they built next, out at Montauk, out of all this research, was a chair. And he said the chair could reach inside your skull and pull your thoughts out into the open air. So that's the claim. A chair that could reach inside a human skull and pull the thoughts right into the open air. Shockingly, a machine like that didn't come out of nowhere. By this telling, the Navy crawled towards the chair for 40 years, and it left a trail of real ships behind it. We just met one of them, the Martha's Vineyard, a donated yacht with a weird hull number, but she had company. There was another yacht, a real beauty, steel hull diesel engines, built back in 1928 at a shipyard in the city of Kiel, Germany, for a wealthy American named Alexander Dallas Thayer. Her name was the Queen Anne, and in June 1941, the United States Navy bought her. They stripped the luxury right out of her. They renamed her the USS Sardonyx and handed her to a research station up in New London. It was working under the National Defense Research Committee and the Navy's Underwater Sound Laboratory. Now that part's all real. A German-built pleasure yacht turned into a secret Navy science platform. Out in the Long Island Sound, on ships exactly like these, the legend says that the Navy was running its first stabs at the impossible. They'd wrap a ship in current-carrying cable. They'd run power through it at a strange low frequency, one the story ties back to Nikola Tesla, and the goal was almost humble. They just wanted to make the ship blip for an instant, just far enough to dodge a mine. But one of those tests purportedly went way past that. Instead of blinking a few seconds out of harm's way, the ship and everybody aboard slipped 2 weeks backward in time. Real yachts, real Navy labs, and a claim that'll make you call BS. And whatever you do with that, here's the point. By the time anybody breathes the word Montauk, the Navy was purportedly chasing this dragon for decades. And by the early 80s, the legend says it finally came all together. Out on that base, a relaunched program that some call Phoenix 3, and at the heart of it wasn't a ship at all, it was a chair. This is how they rigged it, because the details are oddly, weirdly specific. The chair sat in a dead zone. They placed it under a giant transmitter and above a second antenna that was buried below ground. It was right under the null point between the two. A pocket of total electromagnetic silence. That buried antenna had a name, the Delta T antenna. Delta for change, T for time. And it was shaped like an octahedron. Two pyramids joined at the base, wrapped in coils. A thing that builders swore was designed to bend time itself. Then they put a man in the chair. His name was Duncan Cameron, a psychic, and he was the one. He sat in the chair for 90% of every session they ever ran. Swapping him out cost 2 full days of recalibrating the machine, so they just kept Duncan in the chair. Here's how a session went. Duncan sits down, they throw the transmitter on, and his mind goes blank, empty and clean. Then they tell him what to think about. Say they want a doorway, 1980 to 1990. They have Duncan lock his mind onto it, and a hole opens right in the dead center of the Delta T antenna. Witnesses all described it the same way. A circular corridor with light burning at the far end, and it stayed open for exactly as long as Duncan kept concentrating, not a second longer. But a doorway through time? That's not even the wild part. By the end of 1977, they say they cracked something else wide open. They sat Duncan down in a chair and had him concentrate on a solid object. And that object appeared, out of nothing, out of empty air. Somewhere out on that base, the very thing Duncan was picturing would just materialize into the world. Sometimes it came out faint, like a ghost you could see through. Sometimes it came out solid, real, stable, it would stay. And sometimes it held together only while the transmitter was running and dissolved back into nothing the instant they cut the power. A computer printout actually showed the operators what Duncan was thinking, so they could pick and choose which of the thoughts to make real. They called it pure creation out of thought. Sounds remarkable, but then it gets dark, because once you can broadcast a man's mind, you can aim it. The story says Duncan could lock onto a total stranger anywhere on the planet and see through their eyes, hear through their ears. He could push a thought into your head, and 99 times out of 100, you'd swear it was your own. This type of control ran deeper than hypnosis. One time they say they had him concentrate on a single pane of glass and the window shattered. Now there's one more piece to this machine, and it might be the strangest of all. The chair didn't work right at first. It fought them for years. The fix, it turns out, was to dig out the original blueprint the chair had been copied from, the device they claim was handed to mankind by aliens, beings they called the Syrians. And that alien design didn't run on ordinary electronics. Its coils were wired into crystals, real ones, actual quartz doing the work that no circuit on Earth could do. And those crystals supposedly trace back to one thing: a crashed alien craft. The one the rumors swear is still parked to this day somewhere in the dark under that base. It's running on what they call a crystal drive. So strip this whole story all the way down to the bolts, and right at the dead center of this most powerful mind machine ever dreamed up were crystals. Now stop and think about what they're describing here. A man in a chair who could pull anything out of the air just by picturing it. A faint object, a solid one, a door straight through time. So what happens the day he stops picturing what they tell him to? What climbs out of the back of his mind when the machine is left running and builds that into the real world? Now hold on to that thought. One day in August 1983, that's exactly what happened. So they had a chair and a man in it who could supposedly pull objects out of thin air. But the materializing, that was almost a parlor trick to what came next. The Montauk crew claims that they learned to use the psychic, to see, and not with his eyes, but with his mind, through walls, across oceans, and eventually across time itself. They called it the seeing eye. And here's the breakdown of the allegations. You put an object in Duncan's hand, a lock of somebody's hair, a photograph, something small tied to a person, and Duncan tunes in like a radio trying to find a station, and all of a sudden, he can see that person, he can hear them wherever they are on Earth. That's beyond remarkable. And they didn't stop at living people. It's been suggested they aimed their eye at history. They sat and watched World War I, World War II, they watched it unfold live through the portal, and they took photographs of the past. And then they turned the eye the other way. The story says that they sent young recruits down the tunnel into the far, far future, the year 6037, always to the same spot. A dead city, dead silent, in ruins, nothing moving, nothing alive. And in the center of that city was a golden horse up on a pedestal, with strange writing carved into the base. And one by one, they'd send a recruit to stand there, read the inscription, come back, and report what it said. Nobody ever agreed on what it meant, and to this day, it's alleged that the people running it never said what they were really after. Now, I know exactly how this sounds. Psychic spies, photographing the trenches of World War I, reading graffiti at the end of the world. It reads like a comic book. It sounds like BS. So let me tell you about a program that's not a comic book. It's not BS. It's declassified. It's a United States government fact. While Preston Nichols was out there telling his tale about Montauk, the CIA was quietly paying psychics to spy. It started in the early 70s at a place called Stanford Research Institute out in California. Two physicists, Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, they started testing people who swore that they could see far off places with nothing but their minds. And the reason serious men in suits put real money behind this was fear. Washington was terrified the Soviets were already doing it and getting ahead. They gave the whole thing a clean clinical name. They called it remote viewing. And a few of these viewers became legends in that world. A man named Ingo Swann, a former police officer named Pat Price, and an army man named Joe McMoneagle, who'd come to be known simply as Remote Viewer Number 1. We did a video on psychic spies. Check it out if you get a chance. Here's how it ran. You'd hand a viewer nothing but a set of map coordinates or a sealed envelope, and they would sit and sketch whatever was there. And every so often, they were eerily, impossibly right, sketching secret Soviet buildings, hidden gear, things they had no way of knowing. The program ran for around 20 years, and it burned through around 20 million taxpayer dollars. It passed from the CIA to the Army, it got a permanent home at Fort Meade, Maryland, and it cycled through a whole string of secret code names: Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak. Again, we did videos on all these. And the last one, the name most know it by today, Project Stargate. In 1995, the government finally declassified the entire thing. They dumped tens of thousands of pages out into the open, and then they had it judged. They brought in 2 experts to look at the cold data. One, a statistician named Jessica Utz, concluded the effect was real, that something was going on that plain chance couldn't explain. The other, a psychologist named Ray Hyman, said, not so fast. And the CIA, in the end, shut it down, basically because it was never quite reliable enough to bet a war on. So the government of the United States really did spend 2 decades and $20 million paying human beings to close their eyes and spy with their minds. Got that? That's not Montauk. That's the historical record. So when the believers tell you the government was using psychics, they're standing on solid documented ground. But the real program, the one with the paper trail, asked a man to sketch a building behind a wall. That's the gist of what's evidenced in the records. Montauk says they watched the year 6037 and read words off a golden statue at the end of time. The foundation is real. The skyscraper they built on top of it is made of nothing but potentially baseless claims. And one more thing to those claims. A machine like the seeing eye only works if you have a powerful psychic sitting in that chair. So the Montauk story runs straight into a very dark question. Where do you get them? Where do you find a steady supply of young, gifted psychic minds that nobody is ever going to come looking for? The answer the legend gives is the most disturbing part of this entire story, and we're going to have to walk through it carefully. So where do you get them? If your whole operation runs on a powerful psychic in a chair, then you need psychics, a steady supply of them. And the answer the Montauk legend gives to that question is the darkest, ugliest claim in this entire story. I'm going to be careful here because what I'm about to lay out for you is exactly that, a claim with, as you'll see in a minute, nothing solid underneath it. Yet it sits at the dead center of the legend. So let's look at it straight on. The story goes like this. They say the project went hunting for boys, young men, teenagers, and the lore gets pretty specific about a type, blonde hair and blue eyes, which ropes Montauk straight into another thread that these books push hard, a claimed Nazi connection, old eugenics ideas that never really died. They say these boys got picked for one cold-blooded reason. They were the ones nobody would come looking for. Runaways, drifters, kids who already slipped through the cracks. They were purportedly brought to the base and put through something the books call simply programming. It's a brutal process meant to break a young mind down all the way and build it back up into something that could be steered, switched on, switched off, a programmable human being. They call them the Montauk Boys, and the claims of what was done to these boys in the name of programming are genuinely horrifying. Abuse, deep trauma, things I'm not going to lay out in detail, and honestly wouldn't even if the story were true. And the numbers the believers throw around are almost too big to hold in your head. Not dozens or hundreds. Some versions put it as tens of thousands. A terrifying thought. Now let's bring this back to reality. Put the skeptic's hat back on. Because a claim this enormous and this evil demands proof. And there's none. There's no police reports, no missing person files that lines up, no bodies, no crime scene, no paper trail, not a single boy that anybody has ever been able to name and trace and prove was taken to that base. And think about the scale of it for a second. Tens of thousands of boys vanishing off American streets and not one mother, the police department, one nosy reporter, nobody ever notices the largest mass kidnapping in American history? Maybe. Could be part of a greater conspiracy of underground human trafficking. We've done several videos on that topic, but in this case, it seems less likely to be the case. Now here's something you should know about when this story showed up. These books hit the shelves in the early 90s. That's right in the dead center of this very particular movement in this country, a wave of panic about secret, organized, ritual abuse of children, supposedly hidden in plain sight everywhere. That panic swallowed daycares, families, totally innocent people. Lives and careers got burned to the ground over it. And in case after case, investigators kept finding the same thing. Nothing. The crimes never happened. The Montauk story was born right in that climate. It was built out of the exact fear and standing on the foundation based on recovered memories and nothing else. Now, I do want to be fair because there's a reason a story like this sits in and syncs with an otherwise level-headed person. And the reason is the government really did some terrible things like this on many occasions. Just look at the channel library. Enough said. There was a CIA program, MK Ultra, documented, admitted to under oath, And under that program, the agency really did experiment on human beings, sometimes without them knowing, sometimes on people least able to fight back. Real human beings were genuinely harmed. That's in the historical record, and it's a stain. So when somebody tells you the government once experimented on people who couldn't defend themselves, they aren't making that up. That part is real. But here's the line. Those documented abuses, as dark as they got, were not this. There's no MK Ultra file, no declassified page, nothing that describes the United States rounding up tens of thousands of children and marching them off into a Long Island bunker. The real history is just bad enough to make you wonder, though, but this is nowhere close to proof. So this leaves us with the single heaviest accusation in the whole Montauk story, resting entirely on the word of a small handful of men. Men who say they were there, who say they remember it, who say they lived through it. And if this entire legend is going to stand or fall, it stands or falls on them. So I think it's about time we met them. Let's meet the men, because just about everything you've heard in this video, the chair, the boys, the time tunnel, the monster, it all traces back to a small handful of people who say they didn't just hear about Montauk, they lived it. And the loudest voice in them all belonged to a man named Al Bielek. And Al Bielek's story is a thing to behold. Bielek claimed that he wasn't born Al Bielek at all. He said that in another life he was a man named Edward Cameron, and that Edward Cameron was a sailor standing on the deck of the USS Eldridge on the day of the Philadelphia experiment. He said when the field was switched on and the ship went mad, he and his brother Duncan did the only thing they could think of. They ran for the rail and they jumped, but they never hit the water. Bielek said they fell through time. He claimed he was thrown forward to the year 2137. He spent 6 weeks there. Then he got bounced back again to the year 2749, where he says he lived for 2 whole years. And then the story goes the government brought him back home. But you can't just hand a time traveler his old life back. So it's alleged that they took Edward Cameron, aged, regressed him, shrank him clear back down into a baby, and slipped him into another family, the Bieleks, who had just lost an infant son. Edward Cameron grew up as Al Bielek. He became an engineer, and eventually, the story goes, he went to work out at Montauk. And Bielek had no memory of this for most of his life. The memories of being Edward Cameron on the Eldridge, of falling through time, only came back to him in the mid-80s. Now hold on to that date, the mid-80s. We're going to need it in a second. His brother in the story, Duncan Cameron, you already know him. He's the psychic, the man in the chair. And Duncan's version comes with its own impossible wrinkle. Because the Duncan who jumped off that ship in 1943 and the Duncan who sat down in the chair in 1983 aren't even the same body. They claim his original body aged into nothing and that his soul got dropped into a younger one, born years later on purpose just to keep him in the game. Like I said, a thing to behold. So, this is the basis for the entire theory. Entertaining, but likely nonsense without proof. And now, we have to do the uncomfortable thing. We have to check it. So let me take you back to that date, the mid-80s, when Al Bielek's memory supposedly came roaring back, because something else happened right before that. In 1984, a movie hit the theaters, a Hollywood film. It was called The Philadelphia Experiment. And here's the plot of that 1984 movie. 2 sailors aboard the USS Eldridge during a secret Navy experiment gone wrong got thrown off the deck, and they travel through time. Aha! 2 men, the Eldridge, the experiment, thrown off the deck through time. That's the movie. And that is basically exactly Al Bielek's memory. A memory he didn't have until right around the time that film hit the screen. Now, I can't climb inside that man's head. Maybe it's the wildest coincidence in the world. Maybe the film triggered a legitimate repressed memory. I can't be certain. But when somebody tells you they dug up a long buried memory and that memory just so happens to match a movie from the year before, a careful person has got to raise an eyebrow here. And it gets worse. When researchers went looking for Edward Cameron, the real sailor, the man Bielek swears he used to be, they came up with nothing. No service record, no birth record that fits, no trace of any Edward Cameron who matches the story. The documented man is Alfred Bielek. He was born 1927, an electronics guy, and that's about where it ends. So step back and look at what's holding this whole legend up. A star witness whose testimony mirrors a Hollywood film. A brother who says he's living in his second body. And before them both, Preston Nichols, whose entire story, remember, came from a recovered memory he didn't have until he went digging for it. 3 men, 3 sets of memories, and not one shred of documented evidence to back up a single piece of it. That's the foundation. That's the whole thing. But I'm also not going to sit here and tell you that the United States government is clean. That'd be a lie, and it would let them off the hook for a whole lot of things, because some of what the Montauk believers are reaching for, the secret programs, the experiments on real human beings, the things done in the dark and buried for decades, some of that isn't a movie, and it's not recovered memory. Some of it is a matter of public record, and that's exactly where we're going to go next. So we've torn this legend down to the studs. The witnesses don't hold up, the records don't exist, the wildest claims rest on a movie and a pile of recovered memories, and it would be easy to stop right here, laugh the whole thing off, call everybody who ever believed a word of it a fool, and call it a night. But I'm not going to do that. Here's the uncomfortable truth that keeps a story like Montauk breathing. The reason people believe the government would beam energy at human beings and experiment on them in secret and bury it for decades is that the government did exactly that. We got it on the record, on paper, with a budget. Look back to the very start of this video, the 1969 meeting, the plan to expose people to radiation in the dark. I never told you why they were sitting in that room. Here's why. For years, the Soviet Union was aiming a beam of microwaves straight at the United States Embassy in the heart of Moscow. Day after day, year after year, invisible, silent, washing over American diplomats while they ate, slept, and worked. They called it the Moscow Signal. We did a video on it. When Washington found out about it, they made a cold choice. They didn't tell the people in that building, and the staff started turning up with elevated white blood cell counts. Some of them got sick, and still, nobody told them what was raining down on them every single day. It wasn't until 1976, more than 2 decades after that signal was first aimed, that the people were finally let in on the secret. And behind their backs the whole time, the government was busy studying them. There was a research program built around it, and its name was Project Pandora. They ran experiments on monkeys, microwaving them to clock what it did to their behavior. And the embassy staff, at one point the government decided it wanted their blood to test for damage, but they couldn't very well up and say, we'd like to test your blood for radiation damage that we didn't tell you about. So they made up a cover. They told the staff that it was a study about a virus, the Moscow viral study. And under that lie, they drew their blood and they went looking for harm. This isn't Preston Nichols talking this time. This is a declassified record of the United States government, a program that ran for years. It cost over $4.5 million and treated American citizens like test subjects without their knowledge and without their consent. And Pandora wasn't alone. You've probably heard the name MK Ultra, the CIA's hunt for mind control, and the story of MK Ultra has a body in it. His name is Frank Olson, a government scientist. In 1953, the CIA slipped him a dose of LSD and never told him. 9 days later, Frank Olson went out the window of a New York hotel, 13 floors up. He didn't make it. We did a video about him. It's a true tragedy. The government called it a suicide and buried its own hand in it for more than 20 years until a federal investigation finally dragged the truth out into the open. Secret radiation on American diplomats, mind-controlled drugs slipped into a man who never said yes, cover stories, a dead scientist, decades of silence. That's real. Every word of it, footnoted, admitted, it's part of the public record. So no, the people who look at their own government sideways, who wonder what's been done in the dark, they're not necessarily crazy. History has earned them that suspicion. I might argue many times over. But here's the line, and it might be the most important line in this whole story, because everything I just told you, as dark as it gets, has something the Montauk Project doesn't. It has evidence. The Moscow Signal has documents. Pandora has a budget. Frank Olson has a death certificate, a settlement, and an apology from the United States of America. Montauk has a chair nobody can find, a tunnel nobody photographed, an army of boys nobody ever reported missing, and a monster that lives only in the memories of the men who can't keep their story straight. The real history is the seed, and Montauk is what grows in your mind when you water that seed with fear and 40 years and nobody ever telling you the whole truth. So that is where the evidence runs dry. But the legend, it's got one more chapter left. The big one, The ending, the day the believers all swear it came crashing down, August 12th, 1983. So let's go back one last time to August 1983. The believers say it started days earlier, August 5th. A directive came down, turn the transmitter on and don't turn it off. So they don't. Day after day, the machine runs around the clock, pouring power into that antenna, into that chair, and for a solid week, nothing at all. And then August 12th, the story says the machine dropped into sync, everything locked, and a doorway tore itself open. But this time, it opened onto something specific, something 40 years gone. They say the year on the far side of the hole was 1943, and the ship they could see through it was the USS Eldridge. Here's where we tie up this piece in a bow. They claim there's a cycle, a 20-year beat, 1943, 1963, 1983. Every 20 years, the same date, August 12th. And in 1983, they say Montauk reached back across 4 decades and shook hands with the Philadelphia experiment. And right there, with a hole ripped in time, the crew finally lost their nerve. They had enough. There was, the story goes, a kind of emergency plan, a way to pull the plug if things ever went too far. And someone walked up behind Duncan Cameron, still sitting in that chair, eyes closed, mind wide open, and said 4 words: "The time is now." And Duncan, exhausted, broken, pushed past anything any human mind was ever built to take. He let go, and something came out with him. Nothing like a thought he was handed. Object manifested on command. This time it was something from the deepest, darkest basement of his own subconscious. And the machine did what the machine does. It took that thing and it made it real. They say a beast appeared on that base. Big, hairy, hungry, and mean. Witnesses could never agree on how big. Some swore it was 9 feet tall, others 30. Make what you will of that. But they all agree on what it did. It went tearing through that base, smashing everything in its path, devouring anything it could get its hands on. A monster dragged out of a man's mind, handed a body by a machine. Real smart. There was only one way to kill it, apparently. You couldn't shoot it, you couldn't outrun it. You had to kill the thing that was dreaming it. So they turned on their own equipment. They took axes and torches and bare hands to the transmitter, to the wiring, to the chair. They tore out the heart of the machine. When the power drained away, the beast started to fade. It got thinner and dimmer, and then it was just gone. Faded right back into the nothing it crawled out of. The portal closed, the hum died, and the Montauk Project was over. That's how the legend ends, with a monster and a handful of terrified men taking fire axes to a machine that they spent years building. And then, they say, came the cleanup. The personnel rounded up, debriefed, their memories scrambled, and the men sent on their way, the doors sealed, the lights shut off, and the most secret base in America was left to rot in the salt air. Which is just about exactly what really did happen to that base, purportedly. The Air Force shut Montauk down. They walked away from that giant radar tower and left it standing right where it was. And to this day, it's the last of its kind in the entire country. It's still up there, still rusting. And here's a question. If this is all just a story, the dream of a few men with bad memories, then why, 40 years later, are we all still talking about it? I'll tell you why. It's because it got into the water supply of an entire culture. You've heard of the show called Stranger Things, the biggest thing Netflix ever made, a worldwide phenomenon. When the Duffer Brothers first dreamed that show up, it had a different name. It was called Montauk. The original pitch, the document fans now call the Stranger Things Bible, sat right there. A government secret lab in Montauk where shadowy men experiment on a little girl with psychic powers until one day she escapes. Sound familiar? A psychic kid, a secret government lab, experiments on children. They eventually moved it all to a made-up town, Hawkins, Indiana. But the bones of it all, the DNA, came straight from Montauk. And it didn't stop there. There are documentaries. There's the Montauk Chronicles, which won a film festival award. There are books, websites, a whole web of true believers. And right now, as I'm sitting here talking to you, the legend is having a moment. The final season of Stranger Things just dropped, and out at the little Montauk Library, the requests for old photos of the radar base went through the roof. And not surprisingly, the state of New York in 2026 announced a plan to build a campground out there. Glamping, luxury tents, on the grounds of the most notorious base in America. So before too long, you might just be able to roast a marshmallow in the shadow of the Montauk radar tower. So is that it? The monster? There's no proof. The tunnel through time? No proof. The army of stolen boys? No proof. The chair, the aliens, the man who swears he fell through time? It rests on movies and memories, not one single piece of documented evidence. By any fair standard, the Montauk Project, the way Preston Nichols told it, didn't happen. But you can't quite walk away clean because of what's left once the story burns off. We've still got a real base, a real tower, abandoned in a hurry and left to rust for 40 years. We also have real documented, admitted to programs where the government of the United States really did beam invisible energy at human beings, really did slip drugs into people who never said yes, and really did bury it all for decades. And that is why this story has teeth, because the honest truth is there's a line between the government did terrible things in the dark and the government did this. And most of us aren't completely sure anymore exactly where that line sits. So, Montauk, what do you think? Is it all BS, or is there something more to it? Did something actually happen out there? Chew on that for a while. I'm John Genoa. This is America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.